But we're going to have like a really interesting discussion also here about one of the most, let's say, interesting, important, but also challenging spaces in which blockchain is being applied, that is around digital identity and identity management. And we all know, and we have always all discussed and follow the debates around self-sovereign identity, for example, a couple of years back. But this is going to be quite an interesting discussions about the applicability of blockchain-based solutions to identity management, especially in the digital age, and digital identity solutions. And one of the things that the panel will also try to focus on is really the challenge of interoperability in that space, in particular in terms of the different technical solutions, but also the different regulatory frameworks, and also the collaboration, the cross-border dimension of recognition of identity credentials through blockchain solutions. So we're really delighted to have this panel that is also going to be an interesting discussion and dialogue between public and private perspectives on that challenge, both at the national and the regional level in the case of the European Union. So the way I'm going to present the panelists quickly, and we'll have several rounds of discussions with them, but I will also open the floor later on for questions and answers that you may have, and then if you do, at the end also you introduce yourself and then ask your question to the panelists that you want to ask the questions to. But we have four fantastic panelists with these different perspectives on blockchain solutions in the identity space, and we have with us Irene Hernandez, who's the CEO and founder of Gattaca, which she will explain what Gattaca is right now soon. We also have Ellen Kopman that joins us from our partners in the European Commission in DG Connect. Erik Zvaigzne, Vice President of Product Innovation and at ConvergenceTech. And he also will share with us what they do in that space. And Teemu Karjanen, from the Ministry of Finance in Finland, where they work around blockchain solutions from the Ministry of Finance in particular. So in this first round, and let me start with Irene, Irene, you can tell us a little bit who you are and why you're interested in that space. What Gattaca is doing in this space that would be relevant for that discussion on identity.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Okay, let me start with a true story. I woke up today and I took a taxi at 5 a.m. in my home city. And the driver was driving this super nice electric car with a big screen in the middle and stuff. And his rear left window was broken. And the guy was obviously not very happy about the situation. Some thieves had broken his parking lot the previous night. But what struck me is that what he was most annoyed about is the fact that his wallet had been stolen from the car. And he was complaining about the fact that he had now to go to the police, report the incident, and that now he had to get a new national ID. And what these people, these thieves, could do with his national ID, whether to perform illicit transactions. And that to me was very relevant and very opportunistic for the topic at hand, which is interoperability and digital identities. We know that an economy is based on its capability to perform or to deliver trust in those transactions. And we have that kind of solved in the physical world. We have these trust anchors, national IDs, certificates, titles, you name it, all sort of paper-based documents that enable that trust. Setting aside, obviously, the problems that my friend Alfonso, the taxi driver, had. But the pandemic has shown that in the digital world, individuals and organizations are facing many challenges to conduct trustworthy transactions. And this is why this has become a priority for governments and organizations across the world to enable this trust. Because in reality, it has become evident that the resilience of our economies will be based on our capabilities to shift to a digital operation. And digital identities is that key enabler. So, okay, we all agree let's go digital, let's build digital identities. Why is interoperability so important? So I guess the answer is quite obvious. Interoperability is important because our economies are interconnected. Supply chains are almost always cross-border. Internet has no physical frontiers. Sectors are blurring their lines. We need a digital identity that is recognized internationally. But we, from experience, and I will tell a little bit more later on, from experience, we know that there are increasing risks in achieving that interoperability. We have vendor locking risks due to technological choice. We have also a fragmentation of standards, a lot of standardization bodies sometimes doing the same thing in different ways. And finally, we also have the platform capture, which is the risk of big players overtaking the market and hence having an outsized influence in the definition of those standards. Little bit about my background and especially my work that is relevant to this discussion today. I'm the founder of Gattaca, as Carlos was saying. We are a cybersecurity company that builds self-sovereign identity technology, SSI technology. We've been doing that for the past 4 or 5 years. We've been very involved with the European blockchain network project at European level. We've helped the European Commission define SSI specifications. We've worked with national authorities on conducting pilots. We're actually working with one of them in helping them define their SSI strategy and building actually technology. I've been personally involved in conversations between Europe and Canada on building that interoperability across both regions. I will also talk a little bit more about the challenges identified during those conversations, the commonalities, and everything related to achieving a common approach and common support for digital identities. And I've also participated in a global interop initiative funded by the European SIF Lab program and recently donated to DIF on enabling interoperability between wallets and verifier components. So just to finalize my opening and to giving the mic to my colleagues here, I would like to emphasize that interoperability is a super complex topic. And it's, as we were discussing in previous conversations, a layered approach. There is many different layers to interoperability. At the main level, we have technical interoperability, but these can even be broken down in further levels because we can be talking about the interoperability we seek at technology level, like does the Ethereum network interoperate with the Bitcoin network? In the case of SSI, is the EPSI project interoperable with Hyperledger Indy? These sort of things. But there is also interoperability at vendor level. Are these two different tech providers interoperable? Can I, give my credentials from one wallet to another? There is also the old world, new world type of interoperability. Can I establish those bridges between what is being done and what will be done in terms of digital identities? And then there is this whole governance and policy layer in interoperability that's also very challenging. Thank you.
No, thank you, Irene. I think these issues will be discussed in depth in terms of, the more decentralized the system is, the more interoperability is important. But let me turn to Erik and let's go to the other side of the Atlantic here. Can you tell a little bit more about ConvergenceTech and your interest in this space as well?
Sure, yeah. So great to get the chance to speak about some of the work that we do with ConvergenceTech. And we're really a technology development firm. So we do a lot of work with decentralized systems and decentralized databases, blockchains, digital identity, and those sorts of things as well. And to that end, we've got a lot of experience on the implementation side, designing and implementing these things. So we've done some work with government sector, with financial sector, healthcare and education as well. So a broad spectrum of solutions that use verifiable credentials and some of these kind of technologies to create these new identity systems. So we're very interested in, I guess, the practicalities of making this space work. as part of what we do, and big supporters, again, of open standards and open systems and those sorts of things, because those are foundational to a lot of the interchange that's required to make a lot of this work. So to that end, I guess, carrying on from the prior points there, yeah, interoperability is complicated because there's a lot of different themes, let's say, along the way that need to be considered. And I think the three emerging that we see most often would be the whole policy and governance side of things, where, well, trust frameworks are hard in terms of creating them and creating those ecosystems and networks, as they are with any sort of identity system. But then also, even if we get this right, and this is the thing that we do have to start working on now, and we can trust the information and who it came from, what is that information? What does the credential mean after authentication? So that whole idea of, are these two licenses equivalent? Are these two degrees equivalent? What sort of entitlements or permissions are granted after acceptance of these things? That's a big part to making interoperable digital identity useful, and not just another single-use passport or something like that. So I think that's a big point of consideration. And then, yeah, diving into the whole protocol and technology space. Yeah, digital identity, again, cursed by being quite complicated in terms of what it is and some of the cryptography and emerging pieces in and of itself behind it. So it's a very nuanced thing to understand, where on the one level, you've kind of got this whole idea of people moving towards these common open standards, decentralized identifiers, verifiable credentials, if you've heard of those kind of things. That's great, but we find ourselves in a lot of conversations with sort of governments or other people kind of purveying these technologies, where that's where the understanding ends, and then they think that we've created an interoperable system. But that's more the theory or the ambition of these standards, and there's a lot of technological nuances in terms of how it's implemented right now, just given the early stage of the tech, that people really need to be mindful of. Because I think we're really heading towards a world where we can all go with the same principles, these big frameworks, these big standards up top, but underneath it all, it might be this whole multi-protocol thing where we need to really then get our act together in terms of being able to collect these things from different geographic regions and jurisdictions and the like. So that's the other big element. And then the final one would just be the practicality of using this kind of technology itself. So similar to the multi-protocol support, I think the whole idea of us having multiple devices, multiple wallets, if it's a truly portable identity, it should be on your phone, it should be on your computer, maybe even in your smart car or whatever's kind of coming. So there's a lot of technical work to be done in that sense too, to make sure that we're clearing the pathways for innovation to happen there, so that this can all, again, be realized as something better than just sort of a verifiable sticker, and something that's actually meaningful to exchange for information. And to that end, the other piece, and this is where I think when we start talking about interoperability, I'll talk about the non-blockchain side of things right now, because the Web 2 world's not going away. The foundational infrastructure that runs a lot of our systems and services, a lot of corporate enterprises, there's a need to centralize data, and then there's a need to actually make these kind of new technologies interoperate and work with Web 3 in these decentralized patterns. Because until we do that, yeah, it's going to be very difficult to see meaningful adoption in enterprise, I feel, to leverage all of the existing technology assets out there. And no one's under any illusion that everyone, all these big corporations and companies are just going to rip and replace all of their technology and throw in some blockchain ledgers and stuff like that. So it's really interesting to think about, to accelerate this ecosystem, what parts need to be built almost as like a public service, what kind of tooling needs to be put in place to bridge and work with the existing technologies, and then where does that leave us on the scale of deploying this stuff, because we're also against the gun here in terms of time. Lots of people, lots of big companies, Silicon Valley, big tech is really keen on digital identity and this whole idea of controlling the identity layer that doesn't exist on the internet. And if we're too slow figuring all of this stuff out, then that's the fear, is that we don't realize the full potential of this technology to really be a meaningful proxy for an ID card, like a plastic ID card or a passport, and it just becomes a novelty adopted by a small segment of the population who's interested in this kind of stuff.
No, thanks. I mean, that's a critical issue that we'll have to discuss, because I think the question here that Erik is also putting is, there's technical challenges related to the technology itself, but also the policy domain is very complicated in terms of identity and digital identity. And this is something that at the OECD we're working on in terms of international standards on digital identity. But the policy domain is probably more sensitive than others, and that's where where governments have a lot of responsibilities as well.
Really?
And tell us a little bit what you do in Finland about it.
Yeah. Thanks, Carlos. I'm Teemu Kärinen from the Finnish Ministry of Finance, and I guess that I'm representing the national regulatory and policy-making kind of viewpoint in this panel discussion. So I think that this is exactly the right type of people that we have here. So we have a good representation from private sector and also from public sector, both from national and cross-border side. So this is also reflected to my daily work at the ministry. So first of all, I'm taking part in a national digital identification development program where we're kind of reshaping the national digital identity and EID ecosystem more towards this digital wallet type of model, so that we are following the principles of self-sovereign identities. And when discussing digital identities, I quite often keep them together with digital wallets. So that's kind of a technology that is an enabler for digital identities and very very important topic to discuss as well. So we're actually in Finland living some exciting times because the legislative package for our new digital ID is now in Finnish Parliament, and the Parliament is discussing the topics. And it's actually been, from a legislative perspective, quite a challenging exercise because integrating the self-sovereign identity principles to national legislation is actually not a very easy exercise when considering control and governance and liability and accountability. So what it actually means that the digital identity is in the control of the individual. In addition to the national perspective, I'm also taking part in the national coordination of the eIDAS regulation revision and the associated work related to the European digital identity wallets. And in the Finnish side, we're very pleased with this regulation revision that is whose purpose is to lay down a legislative framework for European-wide cross-border digital identity wallets. So that we have a strong regulatory backbone on top of which to start building these new digital identity solutions, taking advantage of the self-sovereign identity capabilities and ensuring interoperability in cross-border interactions, both for natural persons and legal persons alike. And considering this, we have kind of taken a bit of a head start in the Finnish side. So when it comes to the interoperability, we have had to make some decisions when it comes to the interoperability in the different layers that Irene and Erik were discussing here. So when, for instance, considering the trust frameworks, whether we go with a decentralized trust registry or whether we rely on the established centralized trust frameworks and capabilities, these are some of the areas where we have had to make decision making. Same applies to the standards and protocols that we use between the wallets. And on that front, we have been very, very pleased to see the recent developments from standardization organizations like W3C and OpenID taking the initiative to provide open standards and protocols to enable interoperable digital identities and wallet solutions. And finally, the third area where these European digital identity wallets are actually meant to materialize are the Commission-funded Digital Europe program large-scale pilots for the cross-border piloting of the European digital identity wallets. And they're actually, Finland is taking part in 3 consortia. And these are big consortia. There's between 60 to 100 organizations, both from public and private sectors, taking part in each of these consortia. And each of the 3 consortia has over 20 member states included, and also countries from outside of EU, like Norway and Ukraine, for instance, taking part in them. And we see that as a very important forum to actually materialize the European digital identity wallets and see how they work in practice and solve the cross-border digital identity challenges. So I've been very, very pleased with the discussion that I have seen today. It was very interesting to hear the panel discussions before lunch, and there were many topics that are also relevant for digital identities, and I'm glad to discuss those even further.
Thank Timo, and that's also this dimension, the cross-border dimension here also comes into very much into to your discussion, and I think turning to Elena as well now, the European Union has been quite at the forefront of these issues, both on digital identity solutions, but also blockchain. So maybe you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more what the Commission is doing in this space.
Sure, Carlos, thank you very much, and thank you for these great introductions to the topic from various angles. I think is giving us the good backdrop here. So I'm Helene Schöpman. I work in the European Commission in the unit that heads digital innovation and blockchain, and now it's called digital markets. So we are also set in a context where we look at driving innovation through all kinds of digital technologies, and particularly then blockchain, but also in a regulatory context where we look at new frameworks coming into place, and how does blockchain and other technologies fit in that? How can we work on an enabling regulatory framework for these technologies to be deployed? That's basically my job and the mission of the unit I'm heading. What we did, and I think it's already been mentioned by a couple of the speakers here, that we started a few years ago and already tried to look at a way of European countries working together and actually trying to achieve something useful for citizens, cross-border services built on blockchain technology. And that was what was called the European Blockchain Partnership. So that was launched already a few years back. So it includes all the EU member states, Norway and Liechtenstein, in this partnership. And the mission is to roll out a European blockchain services infrastructures that leverage blockchain technologies to provide citizens, the services, and business as well, the services that would be enabled by this technology. And obviously that's also fitting very well what we hear about trust, because trust has become really something valuable, something that public services and citizens understand that this is something that we need, it has value, we need to invest in it, and the technology that blockchain and DLTs have, is fitting in this context, and we wanted to explore that. And first, when you get together in this group, you start to look at what kind of use cases would be valuable for citizens, what kind of ways would be looking at this, and you've very quickly come to the digital identity aspect, because that's really fundamental to any other services basically that you would have in on top of that, and that's something that you need to crack. If you can crack working with digital identity in this structure, then you can build all kinds of things around it. And this is where the discussion distilled down to. Let's start with one use case, and we started with what we call the diplomas use case. The diplomas use case enables students and professionals to go and study further studies or work across borders using a trusted digital identity and credentials around it, so that they can be verified without all this paper-based work and in-person showing up at different offices that we have had in the past. So that's really the purpose of that first use case that is being rolled out, and we're actually in a quite exciting phase of that development, because we are right now in the process of going into production. So we had like 2 years of proof of concept around this, and we have set in place a structure, and it's not only technology. It's really much more than technology. the initiative put in place a cooperation framework between the members of the partnership, and it also put in place a governance framework for the cooperation. So you can ask, how do you govern that? And then you look at the technology, how can that actually enable that cooperation and the governance? And then indeed, how does standards and other things play a role in here? How can we build on the standards available and start to roll out and actually get some experience of using this? So it's not easy. I mean, we have heard that this is not easy. It's not only about the technology at all. It's all these governance structure, but it's also very much about issues such as what do we do next? I mean, what do we do next when you had this platform in place? How does it fit within the regulatory context? And therefore, the partnership has also worked in the sandbox approach. So if you look at, for example, the digital identity and the diplomas use case, in what regulatory framework does that operate? And then you bring in the regulators, the expert regulators of that domain, and you discuss how the service works and how it's compliant in that context or not. And then you work on those issues, and that takes quite a lot of time. That also takes a lot of time. So I think it's all these different dimensions: technology, interoperability, standardization, and the regulatory context that you address at the same time in such a quite complex project. But we are very pleased to have come so far, and we are really looking forward to the next phase of this, where new use cases will come on board, hopefully soon.
No, thank you, Ellen. But let's discuss a little bit this interoperability challenge that we focus the discussion in terms of this. What we had discussed about the different layers of interoperability challenges in applying blockchain solutions to identity management in particular. And Irene, you first mentioned where to look at it, like three types of interoperability challenges: the technological, the policy, and the cross-border interoperability challenge. But tell us a little bit about your experience about some of those, and in particular the perspective from the private sector around the technological interoperability challenge in terms of the different systems and how they can operate together.
Sure, thanks, Carlos. So from my experience, the issue issue of interoperability does not have to do with the fact that we're using blockchain or not. Sure, technological interoperability is very difficult to achieve, but not because we're using blockchain. The main challenge to me is the lack of standards. Standards take time. This is a fairly new approach, one that changes the mindset of how we interact in the digital world. So there's a lot of things to do. And that lack of standards is what is pushing the private sector to fill in the gaps, because we are delivering solutions. Pilots need to be conducted. You need to actually implement something. You need to make decisions. And the problem to interoperability is that technology is running faster than those standards definitions, than that regulatory framework. And so when that regulatory framework comes, then you need to change the technological approach. And the second challenge here is the interconnectedness between the regulatory layer of interoperability and the technological layer of interoperability. Because if you touch or you make a decision in one of them, you will for sure be impacting in decisions made on the other side. And that's one of the most challenges. That's why what I really liked from the experience in the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure project is that they are putting in the same room the private and the public sector. Innovators, private companies that will be eventually consuming this technology, and policymakers, all of them together building those use cases. That's one thing that will somehow reduce the risk of moving sideways instead of forward. The last challenge, in my opinion, is the fact that there is it's an advantage, but also a challenge. There is a huge, very rich ecosystem right now in digital identities. There are standardization bodies working on this, policymakers, regulators, national authorities, regional authorities, tech providers, large companies, multiple sectors, all of them interested in doing their things. The challenge here is that they all have their own agendas. It should be, and they have their priorities, and putting all of that in common is extremely difficult. So I guess there's still a long road until we achieve that interoperability. The good thing is that we all acknowledge that it is the necessary path to mass adoption. So at least we agree on that.
Yeah, no, Erik, I have a little bit the same question about, whether it's a challenge about the technology, or it's about the standards and regulations behind. I mean, but share also, what is the private sector actually expecting from regulators or policymakers in that space, and what would your expectation would be in particular in Canada or other places you've worked?
Yeah, sure. And it's interesting because, as far as the technology goes, you can do decentralized identities in a number of different ways with similar patterns. Blockchain is one variant of it. It's not needed for all, which just, again, shows the whole complexity of the space we're sort of dealing with. And I think that's where the standards and some degree of governance definitely has to have some attention. But one thing I think the governments and policymakers do need to look at is ensuring whatever gets created on the back of this is usable. More focus on the validation use cases, more focus on where you can use these kind of things, because that's critical to actually adopting and using this sort of technology. And that's where, at the end of the day, tech is tech. We've got some fancy tricks here to protect privacy and selective disclosure and personal information, all that kind of stuff, which is good in principle. A lot of people agree with that. But user experience wins every time. And if these things aren't easy to use, if you can't use them in as many places as you can, just picking up a piece of plastic out of your pocket, lower assurance, super convenient, anyone can verify it. Until we get to that point of utility and sort of adoption across the world, it's going to be slow for some of this stuff to gain traction. Because if we don't get that part right, and think about the citizen and how people are going to use these and where to make them useful and stuff like that, absolutely people like Apple or Fido Alliance or whatever are quickly going to be filling all of these gaps into the use case. And then it's going to kind of be that sort of situation where I was saying before, you can use this digital identity, this great privacy-protecting digital identity for government services where, by and large, because of policy and regulation, they protect your data anyway. They don't usually misuse the data. All of the issues usually with the whole correlation, data mining, breaches, selling, that all happens in the private sector. And unless companies are equipped to be able to accept these things, then these digital identities won't get used in all of those use cases where they're needed most. So I think there needs to be a lot of public-private cooperation to be able to make those kind of things happen. Because otherwise, these things won't get used. And then the other piece, again, going to the equivalency of what's in the credential, that's key to it being useful as well. I mean, we've done work in education with a lot of academic institutions, really keen on this whole shift towards skills-based credentialing and changing from a degree into something a bit richer and more dynamic, lifelong learning passports, all of those kind of things. Everyone's super excited about these ideas and adopting the tech and see the potential of how this is better for people and students and everyone. But yeah, then it comes down to what's in that credential, because you can define it in many different ways, which is just outside of the purview of technology, but it's a real problem, I would say. The one highlighting fact of that, I know this is all still early projects in emerging tech. We've done 2 projects so far in healthcare. One with government, where we had to define a credential representing health access to online services, and another was just COVID credentials, so something we did in Singapore. And how the 2 jurisdictions and entities even had the perspective of defining what goes into the credential ended up being the sticking point of how it was so different, because you had a lot of people trying to make it do everything, which kind of misses this whole granular point of reusable data, reusable information, where we're trying to design these sort of systems so that you focus on claims being made, important claims, birth dates, validation of address, where this came from, who issued it, those kind of things, as opposed to getting too stuck on all of the other information that people tend to cram in there. Because as soon as people cram a lot of information in there, it gets confusing and it gets very hard to validate these sort of things. And that's that place that we really have to be careful on too. Because it's not a technology discussion. We shouldn't worry about pushing that part too much. We really just need to make these things usable so that they're actually used and they don't just sit in a box somewhere. Because a lot of education, I think, needs to be done even in terms of the privacy protecting element on this piece, because most people won't tell the difference when they're using it or using it. And selective disclosure is actually a funny one too. Because that comes up a lot as one of those areas for technical standardization, and there's a few different ways to do it now. People are trying to align. From experience, most people don't know how to use that or what it is. So that's back to the whole comment. I think we talked about this before, of something like that becoming a glorified consent box that people don't realize what they're doing when they just give away their information. And then you haven't really changed anything other than giving people a choice. So I think education, I think definitely driving some of the open standards, and then driving these public-private partnerships so these identities are useful in more use cases than just these few public service access ones.
Now I'll go to Teemu now also but you also said something quite interesting also in terms of actually is blockchain actually needed as a solution for digital identity, or it's one of them. But Teemu, from government's perspective, what's the attraction of blockchain in digital identity, and what's the concerns that you see your government and others having in this very sensitive issue, because data leakages in identity are really complicated, aren't they?
Yeah, I think that there's basically many dimensions to this discussion. So, like Erik said, in some cases we need to adopt the existing capabilities, building the trust frameworks, for instance, on existing PKI-based infrastructures. Whereas in some cases it's more useful to take advantage of blockchain-based technologies. So in terms of the interoperability and the role of the government, we basically have multiple dimensions to interoperability. Like we have the public-private sector kind of interoperability. So we need to ensure that whatever regulation we're building, so that it should be and could be adopted by the private sector, so that they can engage in these ecosystems in a meaningful way. Because basically for many private sector organizations, the only way currently to take advantage of digital identities is to misuse individuals' personal data. So there basically needs to be other ways for the private sector organizations to engage than to just misuse personal data. One topic is obviously the cross-border versus national kind of dimension. So if we consider, for instance, cross-border use, what Helen was discussing about the diplomas use case, that is exactly the type of kind of exercises that we need in order to ensure that we have semantic interoperability, so that when data is being shared kind of cross-border, so that it means the same thing. And it's very visible as part of defining the architecture reference framework for the European digital identity wallets, what is called the toolbox work, how difficult even these very simple things like unique identification are when you are considering it from 27 member states perspective. There are very different ways how unique identification of individuals is done in different countries. Finally, I would also like to raise the topic of different types of digital identities. So obviously, quite often we're discussing about natural persons. So the digital wallet use case for natural persons is probably the most obvious one. So if you consider digitalizing your wallet, you start to think about having your credit card or your driving license or your university diplomas in your wallet. But actually the eIDAS regulation applies also to legal persons, so organizations and companies. And that's also something that as regulators we need to take into account. What does an organization's digital identity look like? How does the organization use its digital wallet? And this is one of the topics, it was very interesting to hear about the decentralized autonomous organizations and how basically organizational digital identity, for instance, could enable some of the use cases on that front. But then again, I'll still go to the data protection and privacy side, because that's also a hot topic in the blockchain side. So it's actually easier for legal persons to take advantage of blockchain-based solutions, because basically the organizations, unless they are of sole proprietorship, can directly take advantage of blockchain. So because GDPR doesn't apply.
Thank you. And Ellen, Temi was already mentioning these challenges related to cross-border interoperability issue. Sorry, excuse my French here. It's hard to say. But I mean, when you look at these challenges in the European Union that has been working on this thing for a while, especially on identity and cross-border recognition of identity for persons and companies, what's the main critical challenges related to the application of blockchain for that?
Yeah, I think we have sort of mentioned them already. I mean, it is really the getting together and the convening of parties and really get government and private industry together to start looking at these problems and like how can we solve them together in our context and internationally, because blockchain industry, the companies that work there, I mean, they work internationally. They want to find, an international market. Same for people. I mean, people also want to move across borders in the EU and beyond. So it actually doesn't stop, there. We can let's bring in another challenge in here. So what do we do on the international level? So I think it's also very important to start talking globally about these issues, and it's actually something we have done. I think it was also mentioned this morning that there's an organization called International Association for Trusted Blockchain Application, in which the Commission is supporting industries getting together on a global basis there, and have started to discuss in what we call the governmental advisory board there, things like digital identity, things like sustainability, and things like the ecosystem building and so on. But in particular on the digital identity use case front, or digital credentials, I think there we also have an opening on the international side, because it's the same problem. We can see the same problem when we work on this with partners in Canada or Japan. They have exactly the same issues. So when we start comparing notes there, so what are you doing? What are we doing? We see a lot of similarities. So I think what we want to do there, and actually was in listening a little bit to the debrief of that working group today in a meeting, the Canada chair there has said that we should go forward with this work. We should map out exactly what people are doing. We should also create some sort of playbook for helping those that are not as advanced as others to like quickly take in what the technologies can offer, so what is available on the market, what other governments are doing, and then start to identify areas or demonstrators that actually makes this work also globally, because that will give an additional impetus, like for a diploma's use case, for example. It's not only about students doesn't want to just work or study in Europe, they want to go abroad. I mean, this is a huge opportunity for young people. So I think we need to work on that level as well, and we are. So I hope that we will reach somewhere there. It's a long journey, I think.
No, indeed. But let me go back also to this question about what makes it so special, the identity space, for these discussions? I mean, is there something special when you compare to other use cases in which you have been working on blockchain? What makes identity similar, but also different from other applications?
I think the key of digital identity is that there are unlimited use cases within the framework of digital identity. It touches every single sector, private and public, across the world. So I guess what's relevant in interoperability, and talking about interoperability of blockchain technologies and the like, is the fact that digital identity is a cross-sector, cross-border use case in itself that then enables a myriad of other use cases. That's, I would say, it's the key. I would actually like to even stress and broaden your mindset about what digital identity is all about, because Timo, he talked about identity for natural persons and legal persons, but we can also talk about identity for things. IoT is very relevant nowadays. Everything is interconnected, our fridges. What about the identity of my fridge? How will my fridge really identify in the network to say, hey, it's me who needs that lettuce? It will be a reality, and we also need to properly identify, securely identify, with the respective measures in terms of security and privacy that those ecosystems deserve. So why digital identity is so relevant? It's because it's the main door to every single transaction worldwide.
Yeah, and I think we all here, all in the room, we all want to know who Siri is, actually, when we call for help. But Erik, you know, also what you experience in terms of the identity space as a special space for blockchain.
Yeah, sure. I mean, sort of as Rain just said, it sort of applies to everything. So it's our chance now, after becoming a digital society and relying on the internet, something that didn't really have an identity layer for people, to try and fix some of what's been exploited over these past 2 decades. It's a chance to make something that is a bit better, because digital identity is so broken right now, relying on like usernames and passwords and all these other various things that are so easy to exploit, exactly because they're too complicated to manage. So it's really a chance to sort of reinvent how we interact with digital, because every single transaction on the internet or every piece of data written would benefit from being able to be tied to a reliable identity in certain cases. So it's a big, challenging problem, but there's a big chance for impact. And for me, I think it's exciting to start thinking about how innovation can also change in tech space and on the internet. If you start putting in some of these protections and restrictions where you can't just, the easiest thing you can do is spin up a company, get a bunch of users and advertise to them, or sell their data or something like that. If that becomes harder and you have to start including the consumer in this equation, what does the next version of the internet truly look like? And now we get to the point of innovation instead of just finding better ways to advertise to people. So that whole potential, I think, is huge and exciting, and it's great to be a part of that with a lot of like-minded people you'll find in the identity community, decentralized identity community, all trying to solve this problem. And then, speaking to what Timo was mentioning as well, the whole fact that it can apply to organizations is I think, an opportunity. There's some different technical considerations there, but what we have done in the past, and this is why we just have to look into some of these existing systems, is set up a lot of infrastructure for digital signing, for issuing passports, for PKI certificates for companies. All of that stuff, this isn't greenfield. This is something we can use existing policy frameworks and onboarding and authorizations and everything like that for, to be able to augment or layer on this new system. So identity always tries to solve the same problems over and over again. A lot of people have already solved them, and we just need to be more mindful of that, I think, when looking for solutions to some of these problems. Because even looking down to the whole layer of all of these multiple protocols and all of these multiple sort of ways to connect and all of the complexities there, that honestly with emerging tech, it's going to take a while for that to be dealt with. But we've already solved a bunch of that stuff in the past with regards to how security certificates work, how TLS and SSL works on the internet. broadcasting and handshakes and everything like that to negotiate protocols. So like it's all in there, and we don't need to reinvent it. We just need to look for those similar patterns we've already dealt with. And if we do, and we can connect then people and organizations in this, which is actually an interesting side topic because jurisdictionally, privacy protecting transactions where people don't disclose data, like a zero knowledge proof, we found those very challenging discussions with people like banks or other people who have a lot of liability because they always need to put it coarsely, need like a throat to choke. So if they can't go back to the data and just say, oh yeah, someone over here cleared them already, that's that whole element that we do really need to look at, I think, on the policy level to say, what's different now that you can use this kind of technology? Because unless those things are uncovered and unless those things are changed, then again, in some cases, it's going to be easier for people to hold on to data and just get back into this old pattern that they were dealing with. So, interesting, complex space. The whole machine identity and identity of things is that whole other layer as sort of IoT becomes more prevalent too, which is huge. So yeah, that's why it's just a great space to be in right now because there's so much potential if we don't screw it up.
Yeah. I mean, also a personal reflection coming from the development field. I mean, sometimes for me, blockchain can be a solution to provide identity to those who don't have an identity, digital or otherwise. And there's certain population, for example, migrants. There's been a lot of solutions that the World Food Programme and UNICEF are putting for providing identity for transfer for migrants in particular. And we see that in Europe, for example, around human and organ trafficking, for example. And how there can be also a solution for those who don't have an identity. So a little bit what was my question, because I mean, I guess in Finland, identity is not an issue that somehow has been resolved itself. So what's the added value that blockchain would have?
Well, I think if you look at digital identities, it's something that we have been doing for decades. It has basically undergone an evolution. I quite often refer to the Christopher Allen's article from 2016, The Path to Self-Sovereign Identity. And basically, it started off with centralized identity management, with each website having their own username and password, and moving on to federated, and from there to user-centric, and eventually to the self-sovereign identities. That is the current understanding of the target state. And we're undergoing an evolution, but the change doesn't happen overnight. So it's especially visible in our national digital identification development program. It's visible in the European digital identity wallet specification work, that we are not ending up in a fully decentralized setup. We are taking the first steps towards that direction, but we have a kind of a hybrid model. We're relying on some of the existing trust infrastructure while making it possible to take advantage of blockchain-based solutions. But basically, even having the kind of capability to take advantage of blockchains opens up a huge adoption potential within the digital identities, because it's basically something that affects each individual and each organization, and basically the doors are open for even wider adoption through identities for things. So like we are taking some concrete steps towards making the blockchain-based digital identity a reality, but we are not kind of there yet, just in the process.
No, yeah, and Ellen, I mean, also, I mean, the European Union has been working on e-identity for a while as well, no? What is actually blockchain adding in terms of value to make it happen?
Okay, yeah, indeed. I think we have been driven by the context we are in right now. I mean, the COVID, the massive acceleration of going online, and people actually seeing that it's great to work remotely. It's great to access all kinds of services, private and public, from wherever you are. And I think that has really accelerated the work on digital identity the last year massively. So I think we have worked for a while. Blockchain brings to the equation, I think, this decentralized technology that can integrate organizations in a quite, matching way. The governance around it, and also have the ability to integrate into sort of legacy systems, because we cannot ignore what context the local context we're in all the time, and we have all kinds of, certification or agency that have their, very, old-fashioned and good databases with good data that we need to relate to with blockchain technology. So it all has to be integrated, and so I think that actually blockchain provides that glue between the organization and the existing infrastructure in a quite good way. But what I think it's time to do now is to really show something. We've been talking about this. Well, industry are doing a lot of things, but also for public services to actually show what can be done there. And that's why it's so important that we go out now in production. People start using these. They have their wallets. They can see, okay, I download this certificate. I have a driver's license. I have this, and I can do KYC, whatever, on my wallet. And you start seeing that there is actually a benefit of this. And then you can start. Okay, what's next? What can we do for sustainability? What can we do for the planet? How can blockchain enable traceability in supply chains and stuff like this? So I know we're in the infancy of this, but I think I also see a bit of a breakthrough coming here now, because what you said, Erik, we can extrapolate, we can transpose experience in some vertical sectors to others, and we can build on it together. I think it's really important that we get together in forums like this, and thank you for organizing it, that we can share these experiences and put everyone on the same level of understanding, and then people can continue work from the various corners, on how to use this technology to the best. So, yeah, I think digital identity is the nut we need to crack all together.
No, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. I think we have about now 10 minutes, 15 minutes to keep on these discussions, and I wanted to open the floor for questions or interventions or remarks that the audience would like to make. So I will invite you to just, if you have a question or a remark, to raise your hand, and now actually in real, not only the little hand on Teams here. But also introduce yourself, and then also and tell who the question is directed to. And if you want, I'll take maybe 2 or 3 questions so that we have a little bit of time to think about the answers as well. But we'll start with the gentleman there.
Hello, first of all, congratulations to the nice panel and the panelists. My name is Michael Gebert from the European Blockchain Association. And one of our things when it comes to SSI is basically, together with the Fürstentum of Liechtenstein, human trafficking, which is one of the largest issues in the world besides anything else we're discussing. And I was wondering, if you have an opinion on that, how SSI or the future of blockchain combined with SSI can not solve, but basically put it in a more or a better future for this dramatic issue that we have right now and will have in the future even more.
Indeed. Sir, also with the hat.
Thank you. My name is Vipin Bharathan. I'm from New York. I'm the chair of the Identity Working Group in Hyperledger. And so I have heard about digital identity for a while. But one of the challenges that I want to question the panel about is the fact that identity is a spectrum, meaning you can go from total anonymity to, let's say, proof that you're a human, to proving certain characteristics about yourself for getting into a bar or something, or which is the most quoted example. The other extreme is having to travel internationally. You already have this passport standards, which are actually quite nice, and they allow you to cross boundaries, legal boundaries, and so on. And also, of course, financial transactions. You have to prove your net worth or your, So there's this whole thing. And I know that you guys brought up the legal persons and the IoTs, but most of the time, they are delegating the responsibility. I mean, some person is ultimately responsible, meaning, somebody who works in the company or somebody who owns a fridge. So there is that delegation piece as well. So, it's probably a too broad a question, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of those questions evolve around how can be used to fight crime, really, in different ways. Who wants to, Erik, you want to jump on which question?
Yeah, sure.
Both.
I can maybe tie in both a little bit. To the second one, I think it is important that SSI is a good principle, and again, it's very good for specific use cases. But the practicalities of the real world mean that in implementation, it is going to rely on gradients, I think, of privacy. So similar to how on the issuing side of things with governments, you're going to have to centralize some infrastructure, centralize some authority to kind of make it happen. I totally see that happening also with SSI in terms of it's a bit of a choice to be on the one extreme end of it, but some people in society are not going to be equipped to manage their own keys, to manage their own identities independently and uniquely. They should have the choice to be able to do that. But far and away, after the boom of decentralization, I think, again, back to the who's going to make it easier, I can see trust services sort of spinning up, who might be custodians of your keys or who might take care of little bits and pieces of the ecosystem, which is still going to rely on the privacy protecting principles and sort of respecting the rights of the individuals, but might not be full-on SSI. But that being said, and then back to the whole idea of controlling identities, that is where the whole idea of how can an SSI identity or an SSI style identity be powerful for impact use cases, and I absolutely think it can be. There's some challenges around maintaining control of where your keys are and your device, which is why the two things are kind of interrelated, but especially in developing economies and things like that. We've also done a lot of work with the United Nations, piloting some of this in those places. Where the technology doesn't exist, this is a great starting point to create a proper version of a digital identity that doesn't need fixing later, for one. And for two, that kind of autonomy that you actually grant someone in that situation, in a situation of duress, human trafficking, those kind of things, absolutely, it is a sense of empowerment in that sense to be able to give this to them in some kind of form where, at least in some record, it can't be taken away. And that's where we actually do some work in Canada as well, working with child and family services sectors. So in that case, it's deploying these kind of identity wallets and pieces of technology to children leaving foster care and sort of transitioning out of care because they have, honestly, problems managing documents, replacing identities, gaining access to critical social services and the like. And when you can use these kind of technologies and put them on things like phones where they're a bit more in control of the individual and then set up those channels so that they can access those services, you start seeing some power. Similarly then, when you can't just take away a document or forge a document or do some of those other elements, I think there is a place in some of these tough use cases like human trafficking where either the ability for someone to hold on to that is going to be a point of power or the absence of a trail that this is real is going to be another thing that can be used in enforcement. So it is, once this gets out there, once we sort out all these problems, one of those potential areas that I think just comes back to it being better for a user to be in this kind of format.
Okay. No, Irene? Oh, no, Teemu then. Teemu first.
Excellent question about the legal person aspect. I'll try to be quick. It's exactly the same discussion that we have been having in the well, I call it the EUDI toolbox working groups, but it's basically the forum where the kind of technical specifications of the upcoming European digital identity wallets are being discussed, and it's kind of this dualistic view of legal persons. So most of for many member states, this kind of a represented use is the obvious one. So there's always a natural person representing a legal person. So the legal person cannot basically do anything by themselves because they don't have any hands or legs. But then there's the autonomous use case as well. And there's actually many organizations and many companies looking at automating some of their business processes through digital wallets with legal person identities. So basically, this could be the type of transactions that don't necessarily require a natural person's intervention. But there are use cases where a natural person is not necessarily involved.
Irene?
Yeah, and perhaps I would comment on the first question. My answer is that SSI or decentralized identities on their own will not solve that huge problem. That's kind of obvious. But it can certainly be used to resolve some of the issues around the problem. We've already tested, and when I talk about we talk about the whole community, about using identity for the people that don't have identities. So in the world, there are more than 1 billion people that really are not into the social system because they can't prove who they are. Migrants, people that are in remote areas with governments that do not provide reliable identity documents, you name it. So this is one of the cases where providing a self-controlled identity to these people could enable them entering into, a secured system, social system that could drive them away from that problem. I guess that's a way I would approach society to tackle that challenge. And perhaps on the second question, that's very interesting because this is something that remains in the minds of everyone working on decentralized digital identities and its delegation. It's a super complicated topic because we're not talking only about delegation of the management of a legal entity's identity. We're talking also about delegation in the management of my children's identity, of my elderly's identity. So delegation happens in the real world, and there has to be a way in which that delegation happens, but in a very secure way, because when you enable delegation, then you're enabling ways and backdoors for other people to use your identity. So that's definitely a very important topic and great question. Thank you.
And Ellen?
I just add on the management, I think related is asylum management, which was also a very big problem for all countries. And we started thinking about this before, and now it became even more urgent with the war in Ukraine and the millions of migrants that came in EU borders, and you quickly had to give them some rights, some social security, some benefits, and how do you link that to the person? I mean, if we would have had an already a sort of light wallet there, and you could download at least that for that person, the rights that they had, I mean, that would have been brilliant. And I think this is one of the use cases we have had on the radar for the European Blockchain Partnership, and we will continue looking at. And we also had the pleasure to welcome Ukraine into the European Blockchain Partnership last month as an observer, so they already start working with us there in that partnership.
No, and the case of Ukraine is fascinating as well, because also they could rely on the DIA and all these identity documents that were also available online through the DIA digital services as well. I think we're going to close here this fantastic session, and really again thanking the panelists for the discussions and to keep on this dialogue. I think just as a word of conclusion, I really like this discussion we had also at the end about how blockchain can be a solution for those who have no identity, and especially in critical situation as we see now in Ukraine. But thank you again, Timur, Irene, Ellen, Erik, and for the discussion. And I think now we have a little bit of a break, and then we go to the next session. Thank you.